Welcome in to the Rockies Insider. I am your Rockies Insider, Patrick Lyons. And while the Rockies and Marlins do battle at Coors Field, had to talk with someone who knows the Marlins quite well, and who better than Eli Sussman from Fish on First. What's going on today, Eli?
It's a pleasure to be on here with you, Patrick. Two franchises that have a whole lot in common, both this season and going back a whole lot further than that. So excited to dive in on this with you.
It's funny you mentioned that history that they have together because, as many Marlins fans know, and I think Rockies fans are somewhat aware, Griffin Conine making his debut. So in the same ballpark, you had both Jeff Conine and Vinny Castilla, two players taken in the 1992 expansion draft. So that was an interesting wrinkle this week that we've had going on. How have you enjoyed, the celebration of Griffin Conine and the re-celebration of Jeff Conine?
It's been fun and somewhat unexpected. He was on our radar entering this year. Griffin Conant has been in this organization for over 4 years now, and we've been following his progress pretty closely. There have been some highs and there have been some lows, and all along there's just been some serious doubt about him as a prospect. To be clear, he's not somebody that they're really counting on heavily to be a part of their future. He's 27 years old at this point. He put in a lot of work and a lot of patience to get to this point, but there were some carrying tools that we've been excited about all along. And it's not only in a self-deprecating way. Like Jeff Conine has been blunt about the fact that Griffin has more power than he does. He has a stronger arm than Jeff ever had. And that's saying a lot for somebody that had such a really distinguished major league career, not only being a two-time World Series champion, but being an all-star, almost 2,000 hits. And his son does have some really impressive traits. He's put in the work to get to this point. And after so many injuries and so many lack of production from their position players this year, this little opportunity opened for Griffin Conine to come up. And I did not go into it with any expectations, but finally gets his first start in that second game of the series. And he absolutely made an impression. He made what I think will be a long lasting memory, not just for him and for the Conine family, but for a lot of Marlins fans. The fact that he had a couple extra base hits, one that almost went out of the ballpark entirely. He already showed off that arm that he has with an outfield assist, and it proved to be, even in a season where the wins and losses are meaningless, it proved to be he was really the difference in them winning that game. One of the biggest comebacks the Marlins have had all season long. And even if it does come against a team that is just as hapless as they are, that makes it definitely an enduring memory right there. So regardless of what Griffin Conine does the rest of this month or for his major league career beyond that, there's a reason why people were looking forward to this. It's very rare to have a father and son not only make it to the big leagues, but to do it for the same franchise. And his dad is so synonymous with the Marlins. And at least at the start of his career now, Griffin has that memory in that same uniform. So this is a case where it's just a great human interest story, and maybe the baseball part of it, we'll see where that goes moving forward. But this is a great start for him.
Yeah, only the fourth Marlins player to record an outfield assist in their first start, and only the second, along with Gerard Encarnacion. Where are they now? Only in 2022, and we're asking where are they now? But with the extra base hit and an outfield assist, and now the Marlins go ahead of the Rockies in the standings for father-son combinations. Rockies, of course, have Eric Young Sr. and Jr. Rockies fans know that, and for the Marlins, they now have the two Conines, but previously they had both David and Ryan Weathers. So 2-1, Marlins go ahead and take the lead. We'll wait to see what happened when maybe one of Daniel Bard's kids make it to the majors in some point, because they are athletes. A lot of athletes for the children of current Rockies right now in that clubhouse. We'll wait and see what happens going forward. But yeah, I wanted to talk a lot today about what's going on with the Marlins, and particularly how that relates to the Rockies, because both franchises are down for different ways, and they've taken two totally different paths over the course of their franchise history, where the Rockies maybe having a little more sustained success, maybe not above 500, below 500, whereas the Marlins have the two World Series, but a ton of fire sales in general. Right now, does it feel like the Marlins just have it much worse than Rockies and Rockies fans? And do you think the Marlins might actually get this back on track sooner than later with new GM Peter Bendix?
It's been quite a roller coaster just in this season alone. It felt like rock bottom, and I think people could see this from the outside. Rock bottom felt like trading Luis Reyes in the first few days of May, something you never really see before, punting on the season that early.
Yeah.
After he was indispensable to what they did the previous season. To get in no matter how you slice it, what they got in return was underwhelming, and just left a bad taste in absolutely everybody's mouth, considering what he meant on and off the field. From that point to where they are now, I'd have to say things are moving in a more encouraging direction, because it was frustrating from anybody's perspective heading into the season that Peter Bendix was the new president of baseball operations, was just not very forthcoming about where he saw the team right now and what they were expecting to be moving forward. Coming off that postseason berth, like, he very vaguely made it seem like they would try to keep things going, keep things status quo, give it another try to be competitive in 2024. And I don't think anybody really believed that was his true intentions. And at the same time, they just entered this year where it felt like there could have been some tough decisions to make entering the year about getting a quicker start on this rebuild, or there could have been more of an investment in the 2024 team to actually give them a chance to be competitive this year. And instead, basically nothing happens. They pick up Tim Anderson, they pick up Christian Bethencourt heading into the year, doing very little else, and a whole lot of injuries pile up, and it turns out to be a worst case scenario. And I think the fear was that they missed the optimal time that just their lack of conviction in anything this past offseason was going to cost them down the road. And I think that they took a really big step forward at the trade deadline. They went all in on emptying out their major league roster, but they also got very good value in return, at least in my estimation, for the guys that they dealt from Jazz Chisholm Jr. to AJ Puck to all these other relievers. They totally emptied out their bullpen in a way that I think makes a lot of sense, especially if you have conviction that you can develop these guys internally on a dime. And what we've seen already just in this Marlins season is an ability to turn trash into something interesting, to turn waiver claims, to turn minor league free agents into interesting pieces. So because of that, it's really an essential part of operating as a small market team. One of the differences between these teams is the willingness from ownership to spend. The Marlins are all the way at the bottom end of that spectrum when it comes to investment, which means they have to do player development very well, and they have to do pro scouting very well. Those just didn't seem to be strengths of the team the previous few years, which made 2023's postseason run all the more remarkable. We are already seeing signs, though, that under like the new front office, that on the margins, they can make a lot of these smart decisions. And if they're also able to extract a lot in return for their proven major league pieces, then they get closer. The bottom line is that this farm system the Marlins had was one of the worst in baseball entering the year. And after all these deals that they made, they have very quickly surged to the middle of the pack. I know with Just Baseball, Arm Layden is a little bit higher than even that, where he thinks his farm system might be above average to this point. It's a pretty significant change to make for a team that had some great players to deal, but no like huge superstar, a team that still kept Sandy Alcantara, for example, that still kept Yuri Perez, guys that are going to be coming back next year. And the prospects that they've gotten in return for the trades that they made are ones that are relatively close to the big league level, including some that already are at the big league level, such as Connor Norby, who's now their everyday third baseman for the time being, and Kyle Stowers, who himself, as we're talking, having his best stretch as a Marlin over these recent days, trying to solidify himself as close to an everyday corner outfielder for them moving forward. The next wave behind them are guys that, if they're not called up when rosters expand in September, they're ones that are expected to vie for serious jobs in spring training. They've really taken a team that had very little depth to a team that now has a lot of depth, but is very lacking in proven star power. The big question is, moving forward, who emerges on the position player side as franchise cornerstones for their team, whether it's Connor Norby, whether it's Xavier Edwards, who is out with an injury at the moment. So the question now is, where's this next star going to come from? And they still have that very big question, because they're not going to be able to spend to acquire such a player in free agency. And they're not going to turn around and trade some of their prospects to get a controllable player of that perennial all-star caliber. But I think they are in a very interesting spot moving forward. It feels like bottoming out this year. They're going to lose 100+ games this year. It's been almost comically funny to watch at times how many different players they've rotated in. They've used 64 different players, and most of them, right off the bat, not a part of this franchise's future in any way. To see this carousel of guys at all these different positions, it's been, I think for the casual fan, it's been a terrible product to watch. But at the same time, I have some optimism that this is somewhat of a gap year before they start now trending in a more positive direction with big decisions hovering over them. It's just everything that could go wrong did go wrong this year. And that's not really a reflection of where they are as a franchise as a whole. I think there is some light at the end of the tunnel.
I think that can be one of the positives for a team that rebuilds in the right way, or in a way like this, where, as you said, you hit bottom. I imagine it like diving into a pool. And if you get to the bottom quick enough, you can then push off the bottom and rocket yourself up to the top of the pool, to the surface of the water. And it definitely seems like Miami is doing that. And it helps to have that buy-in from ownership to allow the GM Peter Bendix, who's had success in Tampa Bay, has that on his resume to say, okay, this person can win with a smaller payroll and can win, with those additions on the margins, as you said, with the waiver wire claims. And, when you have that kind of freedom, it definitely allows you to get creative and do those things to try to right the ship and do it a lot quicker, because you've got those opportunities. You don't have those same connections. On the flip side, for the fan base, you have no connections to the players and
Right.
to that roster, but really strong rotation going into next year, which I definitely think could help, like you said, bridge that gap going forward, so long as they're healthy. And I think that buy-in from ownership really allows a baseball man, a baseball person, to do their job and figure out how to point the Marlins in the right direction. And I compare that with the Rockies, and they really have this sort of three-headed monster in a sense, with the ownership and the front office and the manager, and all three kind of each want a different thing. And I think that really hampers the Rockies in a lot of ways, where ownership and Dick Monfort is thinking a little bit about profit margins. He spends on the payroll. That, don't get me wrong, they're always mid-table, sometimes even just outside the top 10, but he's also thinking about marquee players. That's where you get the Chris Bryant signing coming from. Then you've got the general manager who was there in the room drafting players, and so there's an emotional connection to some guys, and you want to feel like, hey, they're going to pull through. They are going to be big leaguers, and they are going to have value to this franchise. So we're going to give them maybe a few more opportunities than they might deserve. And then you've got the manager who doesn't want to really be around for a rebuild or for tanking, which is a lot harder to do in 2024. And so he wants the veteran guys to be around, even though those veteran pieces are going to be worth so much more as trade assets. So that triangle right there doesn't really work out too well. And it does seem like for the Marlins, it is going to work out well. And, next year will be a big indicator as to who will get on track first, who will get back to the postseason first. Will it be the Rockies or the Marlins? But right now, you probably feel a little bit better about the Rockies, with some of their younger players kind of maybe making that impact. Who the guys are going to be in 2025, whereas you said you don't really know who those players are going to be for the Marlins. Some of them you do. I think Connor Norby is that big one that I'm curious about. He was the big chip that came over for Trevor Rogers. He's been playing really well. Hasn't been as loud as Kyle Stowers, who also came over in that Trevor Rogers deal. But do you think Connor Norby is that player that might have the biggest upside for the Marlins in the next couple seasons?
I like him a lot as a prospect. So I do have him ranked on Fish on First as our top Marlins position player prospect, all things considered. I think he's more of a high floor guy than he is a high ceiling one. As impressive as he's been so far, the exit velocities are still really limited overall. I wonder exactly how much power production you see over the course of an entire season. Although he's off to a very good start in that category. Where he fits defensively, where he's playing third base right now, and he's doing all right. The reports on him as a second baseman aren't great, even though that's his preferred position. And this is an organization that, for whatever reason, the last few years, they have tried to build half the roster, it seems, out of natural second basemen, one on top of the other, on top of the other. So for the moment, they have Xavier Edwards, who's really a second baseman playing shortstop, and they have Norby, who's really a second baseman playing third base. And some of their top prospects coming up through the system are also best suited to be a second baseman moving forward. So that's a question. But specifically with Norby, there's also something fascinating going on with his swing decisions, where he's been very, very aggressive, and it's working out great so far. But he drew, as we're recording this, he drew 2 walks last night, and that triples his season total with both the Orioles and the Marlins. He'd only drawn 1 total walk in all of his previous games before. So that is something that I don't think is going to be all that sustainable right there. More of a floor guy, where I think it's safe to say he's going to be part of this big league roster for a handful of years and likely going to be a starting player. But in terms of one that's significantly above average, that's more than 2 to 3 wins above replacement over the course of the season, he's just a little maxed out physically. So it's going to be about just the baseball skills, trying to transcend what he lacks in terms of his physical gifts right there.
Sounds like the Marlins are the store brand version of the San Diego Padres, who have built a roster out of shortstops. The Marlins going, hey, let's build a roster out of second baseman. Why not? Let's make that work. I imagine they look back and go, man, imagine if we had Craig Biggio back in the day. Oh, second baseman, we could turn him into a catcher, maybe even play center field. I'm curious about what your thoughts are on. We've talked a little bit why this rebuild might go a little bit better than ones in the past, but have you pinpointed? I imagine you have, covering the Marlins for close to a decade, but what didn't work with the Marlins rebuild in 2017 and 2018? Because you go back and look at that roster and you say, holy smokes, some fans right now in 2024 might not even know or might not even remember that all of these guys were Marlins at the same time. And they traded D. Gordon, Giancarlo Stanton, Marcell Ozuna, Christian Yelich, and unfortunately you had the death of José Fernandez. And it sort of makes me think that specifically his death, did that set the organization back a decade, or was that just one of the elements to why there was that rebuild and why the rebuild didn't work?
Yeah, well, the passing of Jose was definitely a turning point for the franchise. It was unquestionably a factor in terms of why the franchise was sold by Jeffrey Loria and put on the market, because of how personally connected those two were. And he'll always be irreplaceable. To this point, there's not been a single player that really comes close to locally having the same type of appeal, the intangible draw, really a magnetic presence that he had. It's been impossible to replicate in that regard. At the same time, they did bring in a whole bunch of new people to make these decisions, and it just seems like it was the wrong people calling the shots when it came to that rebuild coming off the ownership change, where Derek Jeter was the CEO and Gary Denbo had a very loud voice in player development and scouting. So this amount of influence that they had over the organization really didn't work out well for anybody. These were people that probably should not have been making these really crucial decisions, trading these type of perennial all-star hitters, well, really MVP caliber players in both Stanton and Yelich, and further down the line the following year trading JT Realmuto. There was a philosophy that prioritized tools and athleticism over actual baseball ability. There were a handful of guys they brought in that it was contingent on them learning how to hit or learning a lot of these very basic fundamental skills deep into their professional careers that were going to be very difficult to change. And that's why there were some very high profile busts with the players that they brought in. And the Yelich trade is going to always be the most famous example of an absolute most lopsided trade you could possibly imagine for somebody, his career going to new heights immediately after getting traded. And the 4 players that they got in return combining to be all sub replacement level in Marlins organization. None of them are even playing affiliated baseball anymore at the moment. That will always be the shining example of that. But they stuck it out for...
And one of those players is playing football right now for the University of Arkansas, right?
Absolutely. Monte Harrison will be following. I'll keep following him closely, rooting for the best that he could provide. That was the guy they brought in that his tools were off the charts, but simply could not hit. And it bore out very quickly that was not going to work out at the major league level for them. So the whole for really that extended stretch, and even after Jeter leaves the franchise during the lockout heading into 2022, the couple of years that Kim Eng had as a GM, calling the shots, bringing in her own people, this is a franchise that needs to be great at player development. And maybe now they're turning the corner, but during that entire stretch from the initial ownership change all the way through last year, through 2023, so many guys, especially on the position player side, were coming into the organization and they were not getting better, or they were somehow getting worse. It was so inefficient, whatever they were doing. The lack of resources that they were devoting to player development down there, the lack of technology that they were using in order to get guys better. And there wasn't even a huge investment on the scouting side either in order to get an edge in that department. It led to this situation where the farm system was completely barren. Some of the few guys that they did have that showed some promise were traded into other organizations. They needed just a total overhaul of how they go about the behind the scenes infrastructure stuff in order to catch up with most of these other organizations. Maybe they're finally doing that. In the meantime, the very bizarre circumstances are that they did make the playoffs 2 separate times during those years, both in 2020 during the COVID season, and then over an actual full length season last year. From following those teams, you knew in the moment that it just wasn't reflective of the actual talent on the field, that it was not going to be sustainable in there. Also, but at the same time, you have a fan base that had not even made the playoffs during the previous 17 years between 2003 and 2020. That kind of success was widely celebrated, and it just put this franchise in this very difficult spot where even when they have success, it doesn't feel like such a victory because it just creates harder decisions for them to make, knowing that they weren't particularly close to building the contender that they wanted to. And I just can't think of a whole lot of other franchises that in both of those postseason appearances, they make the playoffs in 2020 and they fire their GM, and then they make the playoffs just 3 years later and they part ways with that GM. That kind of turnover after having what should be considered like an accomplishment and a job well done, this speaks to this very odd circumstances surrounding this team right now. But it does seem like, for better or worse, they're now committed between Bruce Sherman, the owner, and now Peter Bendix as president of baseball ops. He has a longer term contract than Kim Eng had. We just got confirmation, a 5-year deal. So by Marlins standards, they seem to be moving towards having more continuity from their decision makers. There's going to be a whole lot of turnover on the roster itself. And so that's a whole other conversation about whether that's the right way to go, whether that's going to build a whole lot of fan enthusiasm if you're constantly churning players once they reach a certain salary level. But the most important thing is to have some sort of direction from the very top of this organization. And as a franchise that has had so much turnover from ownership, from the front office, and from the coaching staff, to have an outlook where guys are on the same page and at least seem committed for a few years to be going by a particular game plan. That in itself is refreshing.
The consistency and commitment, as you pointed out, is unique right now for Miami, whereas that's commonplace in Colorado. It feels like there's a lot of short-term success for the Marlins and long-term frustration because of all of the turnover. And it's almost the opposite for the Rockies, where there's long-term appeasement in a sense for fans, where you do know those names. There is commitment. There is a lot of loyalty in the organization, but the short-term short-sightedness sometimes can get in the way. You go back to the 2022 trade deadline, and the Rockies were the only team to not make a trade, getting rid of veterans to improve their future because, well, these guys are important to the current fabric of the franchise, not for the future, but let's just worry about the present tense and that loyalty. So that is an interesting kind of juxtaposition, between the two franchises. And I mean, I wanted to ask you, and I think it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't, but would you trade in the the Marlins history, the two World Series, for a little bit more consistency, even if it's a mid kind of consistency of the Rockies, and have those players that and there's a Mount Rushmore for the Rockies, right? And there's two Hall of Famers now on that Mount Rushmore, where you can't really say that about the Marlins. Are you sticking with the devil, or would you maybe prefer something like with what the Rockies have?
It's a fascinating question because it just depends on what perspective you're looking at. Personally, I think those World Series are invaluable to have, and people will always look back on those very fondly. If you are running the Marlins and at the highest levels of that organization, then I think you'd prefer the more consistent history without the glamour and the highest peak, because of where this team is from a financial standpoint. By any calculation, the Marlins are the lowest revenue team in baseball, where because they're so far removed from those championships, but more specifically because there is that history of totally turning over the organization even after the few successes that they have. That has scared so many people away. It is increasingly rare to find people that are multi-generational Marlins fans that would subject their children to what they went through during the franchise's earlier days, just because of how much misery and turmoil that they've gone through in those years. And so they're in a situation where, the attendance jokes are everywhere, and they have been a part of the fabric of this team for decades, where people just don't show up to games. And because there are just so few people that are deeply passionate about this franchise after all they've been subjected through the years to this point, and it makes their future outlook very, I wouldn't say gloomy, but there's a lot of work to do in order to change that, to build up this fan base that I think by most calculations would be the smallest fan base in all baseball, despite being in a relatively big market and despite being in most people would consider a very sexy location. That there just aren't a lot of people that identify proudly as being Marlins fans because of what they've been put through and puts at the ownership level, even though all these, I'm certainly part of the portion of analysts that believe that all these wealthy people have a lot more to spend than they are currently spending on their teams, that the Marlins are still, as being part of a major league franchise, that they're in a great position and could always invest more than they currently are. There is the reality that this team just doesn't bring in as much as basically any other team. And it's a really rough spot to be in, because honestly, a lot of the blame goes towards the previous ownership and the previous front offices that ran the team so erratically through the years. So the outlook is not great. So even though the history for this franchise, there are a lot of things to celebrate, a couple teams in particular to celebrate that won those titles, and some standout players as well. It is a really dicey future, just because of how they, despite being around for so long, it seems that they've built up very little of that original fan base remains, and they've had a lot of trouble like getting more people enthusiastic about this team moving forward.
Yeah, the Rockies have a similar issue, but I think, you know, Miami, is obviously made up of, a lot of different cultures and people from outside the area, and I think that's also true of Denver and of Colorado. But for every Cubs fan that comes out to Coors Field to watch the Cubs, and Dodgers and Giants fans, et cetera, that are from different parts of the U.S., their second favorite team is at least the Rockies, and they'll still go to games. Whereas I don't. It sounds like it's not the case, and we've seen that from attendance. Is it shocking to you to see Marlins, Rockies, two last place teams getting together on a Monday and Tuesday? Yeah, it's late summer, but kids have just gone back to school, and getting 22,000. Is that kind of mind blowing to you?
Yeah, it is several multiples more than if you flip the tables. If you play a midweek series in Miami between these two teams, you're really talking about sub 10,000 for every single game, if not closer to 5,000 for those games. If that happens, they've tried a lot of different things to market the team in South Florida. I give them credit for effort as well. Ultimately, it's not going to mean a single thing unless there is some sort of sustained competitiveness across more than one single season at a time. They're in a really rough spot for all the things that I mentioned about that. I think they're doing well. behind the scenes and in baseball operations, you're really not going to see anything change when it comes to major league support and the actual enthusiasm around the team from the community for a while. They'll have to actually produce a lot of major league success for multiple years in order to win people over after all the trauma that they've been through the previous couple of decades.
All right, Eli, before we get you out of here, there's 58 players who've appeared for both the Rockies and Marlins, and I've got 5 of them that have pretty much had an even split. And you tell me, are you claiming this guy as more of a Marlin, or are you pushing him over onto the Rockies side? First up, Corey Dickerson. He
Well,
doesn't feel like either, maybe, but he doesn't feel like he resonates with anyone because he has jumped around a little bit.
Yeah, he was such a disappointment for the Marlins off the bat. There was a lot of excitement about when they brought him in the first place. So even though he was there multiple years, he was there for the 2020 playoff run. He hit is really the only positive moment from his entire tenure was a home run he hit in the 2020 postseason against the Cubs. But he is there. There really is no there's no fondness for him in Miami. I think by default, I would consider him more of a Rocky.
Yeah, spent a little bit more time and developed by the Rockies too, of course. So
Right.
I think a lot of people would agree with that. All right, this one, I don't think either of us are gonna want to claim this player, but here it is, José Reyes. Is he a Marlin or is he a Rocky? Or no comment?
I guess the Marlins would claim him. He was okay. I mean, by his standards, he was okay. By most standards, he was a good everyday shortstop for that team in that one year. It just happened to be one of the more chaotic years in the franchise's history in 2012, and immediately dumping him to Toronto, and from there he went to Colorado. Yeah, he didn't do anything wrong other than being a free agent at a time when the Marlins were just had too much money that then they knew what to do with because of their new stadium. So they spent a lot on him. The Marlins will take José Reyes in this case.
Okay, yeah. The Marlins ended up getting Henderson Alvarez, Anthony DeSclafani, Escobar, Adeiny Echeverria,
Yeah.
Jake Marisnick, Jeff Mathis, Justin Nicolino. So okay, so there's probably a trade tree that it still exists right now because of José Reyes. So okay, that has a happy ending. This one is just this player didn't make a major impact, but he's on the field right now in Coors Field. Jesus Tinoco. He was a part of another big trade, coincidentally, with the Blue Jays, the Troy Tulowitzki trade. So he does resonate a little bit in Colorado. Does he resonate enough in Miami to say, hey, he's a Marlin?
As of the last couple of weeks, he's resonating because he's quietly been a great reliever for them in the month since he was claimed off waivers from the Cubs. He got passed around to like 4 different teams in the last 4 months alone. And something seems to have clicked now that he's in Miami. And he did very quietly have a previous stint with the Marlins in 2020
That's
when
right.
they needed to grab anybody and everybody they could to fill out the roster in the aftermath of COVID right there. Yeah, so if you asked me the question a couple weeks ago, then might have said the Rockies answer. But at this point, like I hope I'm not overreacting and thinking that he has a very strong chance of being part of their opening day bullpen in 2025. Just on it seems that a switch may have clicked with him just after being a total afterthought a few weeks ago.
Yeah, was traded to the Marlins for Chad Smith, and then was, I think, DFA'd, and then actually came back to the Rockies before, as you said, kind of being passed around. So, okay, that's a good one. Another current player on the field right now on the corner of 20th and Blake, Jacob Stallings. Now, he's got, I think, 200 games played with the Rockies right now and 202 with the Marlins, and he's more than likely going to come back for Colorado next year. But are you claiming Jacob Stallings?
That's he is in the Corey Dickerson mold where there was quite a bit of excitement when they acquired him, and it was a mess. Like he just did not perform despite his best intentions. The one thing that Marlins fans take pride in is Sandy Alcantara's 2022 Cy Young season. And for people that aren't aware, Stallings was his personal catcher that entire season. Every single pitch that Alcantara threw in 2022 was to Jacob Stallings right there. That worked very beautifully. That brought the franchise their only Cy Young award in their franchise's history. And Stallings, I guess, had some part of it. The fact that he was always given that assignment right there. It was so bad as a hitter, and it was also really bad in terms of the measurable defensive aspects. Maybe he was fine with working with pitchers, but in terms of actually his defense was a big disappointment after being a Gold Glove winner in Pittsburgh coming over there. So I think you shake it all up without even looking. I'm sure he was sub replacement level as a Marlin during those years. I'm shocked at how he's hitting this year because the Marlins had control over him via arbitration entering this year if they wanted to. And I don't think anybody batted an eye when they non-tendered him just because of how disappointing he was. So I'm floored by the success that he has. Even though the tenure with the Marlins was longer, I had to see him more as a Rocky, and I'm sure he would prefer to dwell on this really surprising renaissance that he's had as a 34-year-old with Colorado.
And he's being viewed as the guy for next year, probably trying to pass the baton and pass the torch to Romo. But at the same time, that veteran presence, you're right, having a really good season. So that's a nice story with Alcantara. But as you said, like, it might not be enough. All right. And last but not least, and I know how this one's going to end up going, but I got to ask, because there's plenty of Rockies fans out there that would love to think of this guy more as a Rocky. But I think I know how it's going to go. Juan Pierre.
Yeah, Juan Pierre is absolutely adored by Marlins fans to this day. I think technically he still has some sort of vague role with the organization right now. He's always around in spring training doing coaching activities, and he's 3 years with the Marlins. He played every single game for all 3 of those years. I want to say, like, with few exceptions, almost every single inning for those 3 years as their leadoff man. It's the kind of style of play that people were infatuated with. So many bunt hits, so many good situational plays, and all the stolen bases that he accrued during his time in each of his 3 years down there. And most importantly, the fact that he was part of their World Series winning team in 2003 as the guy batting at the top of that order in 03. So he's one of those few guys that, even though not a superstar player, somebody that I think would be valued differently in today's day and age than he was during the prime of his career 2 decades ago, for the time that he was in, an absolute fan favorite that he was. And to this day, I would think he did play with quite a few different teams over the course of his career overall. He's one of those guys you wish was a Marlin for a little longer than he was, so they can claim him without any sort of dispute. In my eyes, I think it's definitely more of a Marlin than he was a Rocky, but he's overall just an underrated career that he had with several different teams, including Colorado. He was a lot of fun to watch.
Coming back in 2013 for his final season, his age 35 season, actually tips the scale. So that's 4 years with the Marlins, 3 with the Dodgers, 3 with the Rockies. Also won a World Series in 2003 with the Marlins. As you said, part of why he's beloved, was 10th, believe it or not, in MVP voting. That he might be the only player to finish top 10 in MVP voting who hit 1 home run during the season, other than pitchers, of course. Finished 16th in MVP voting that next year in 2004. And because of a technicality, because he was a pinch runner in one of those games, right, playing 162. So, like, technically, his consecutive game streak is kind of broken up. But if we include that, because I think you and I would, 821 consecutive games played for a span, 11th longest streak in baseball history. Juan Pierre definitely does not get enough love. I think now in today's game where, there is a lot more emphasis being put on contact and putting the ball in play. He kind of was doing some Luis Ariz type things, maybe not with as much power, but if you can get that ball in the gap, it's going to be good for 3 bases. So that's a sad loss, I think, for Rockies fans to say, yeah, maybe he's a little bit more of a Marlin, but is such a good guy and is so, well-liked and beloved that I think there's enough room for both franchises to say, hey, we love Juan Pierre. We're also going to claim him as our own, and we'll just have to share him.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that. He is, and I think he would appreciate all the love that he gets from all the different franchises that he was with at various points right there. So, it's hard to find any single person that has a bad word to say about JP overall. And he is still part of the South Florida community. He still lives not too far away from the ballpark, continues to coach. I think he has children that are still baseball playing age, and he coaches them. So he is just a really wholesome figure in both history of the franchise and then even part of the community to this day.
Matthew jumping in the chat. Juan Pierre played with the Colorado Springs Sky Sox also. He's a Rocky. to Matthew. Yeah, he's very well beloved, and is one of those players when you talk to folks in and around the organization. You say, "Hey, can we bring back some former players to represent the club as coaches for these young guys and to show up in spring training and have that connection with the past?" Juan Pierre's name always comes up as a great community member for this franchise. Eli, thanks for joining me. Go ahead and plug away. Let folks know where they can get your coverage at, because it's the best around, no doubt about it. Fish on First do a great job covering the Marlins, and I think there are some people that feel some connection to the Marlins. They might not consider themselves also a Marlins fan, but are curious about what's going on down there, as they are definitely siblings from the 1993 expansion, and the Marlins, as they go through their own rebuild and have some young prospects and try to get better. I think some fans would definitely be interested to know, hey, is that rebuild going to happen a lot quicker than the Rockies? And so go to Fish on First to check that out. Eli, go ahead and plug away.
Yeah, Fish on First right behind me. If you see that logo anywhere that you are on any platform, that's us. Fishonfirst.com is the website. I'm really excited about how we rebooted it entering this season and some of the changes we have moving forward in terms of bring what is definitely unrivaled Marlins coverage. I feel comfort in saying that. I'm proud to have a really thorough team around me that is just passionate about exploring this franchise from all the different angles right there. And yeah, I'm the one that oversees it, for better or worse. If you love something we do, it's probably my staff doing something right. If you dislike something we do, it's probably me responsible for making some sort of questionable take or mistake in there. But I'm really proud of the way that we've grown it since setting it up right there. So yeah, we have our website. We do our live streams throughout the season. We've done them twice every single week, and throughout the off season, at least once a week. Our podcast channel, we have a pretty exciting show dropping on Friday morning. I'm not going to spoil, but we have a pretty good interview. Wherever you get your podcast, just search for Fish on First, and you'll see who we brought in to talk about the past and present and the future of the Marlins. So I think we plucked a pretty good guest for that one. And if you want to find me personally, yeah, Real Eli on Twitter, ELY right there. If you want some of my takes in there. So it's as we said, this is a team that is in a very big transition right now, but we're doing our best to keep up with it and make sense of it so far. And I'm somebody that always finds I'm just very fascinated by the way that things go. I don't get too emotionally attached to the team itself, but I root for something that's slightly different than what they've had before, where there's a more cohesive vision moving forward. And I do feel pretty genuinely like this year is the rock bottom that they hit. So I think it's going to be a more compelling thing to follow from all angles moving forward. And I hope you guys find it here on Fish on First.
I can't stop thinking about Juan Pierre, so I'm going to be tuning in Friday to find out if that's who it is, coincidentally. So you got an extra viewer there, guaranteed. At Patrick D. Lyons, at Patrick D. Lyons MLB, just about everywhere you get your social media, at Rockies_insider on X and Threads. And again, thanks for all the support for everybody making us a top 100 baseball podcast here, and appreciate the momentum you've given us here, Eli. But unfortunately, as I like to say, that momentum is only as good as my next show. So, of course, I'll talk to you all tomorrow.